October the 15th, 2024, and we are projecting the 2024 presidential election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Now, we started yesterday with the very first video. Now I'm following up with new data, and we're specifically using early voting from the website NBC News, along with turnout rates that we're expecting. As you can see, in 2022 midterm election, we had roughly 49% of those voting for Donald Trump vote early by mail or in person early, compared to roughly 65% voting in a similar fashion for Joe Biden. So I've extrapolated that data for the 2024 election. What will we be expecting in terms of who will show up in person on election day is I've extrapolated this data to a spreadsheet. And we're guesstimating here roughly on the Republican side, about 60% will show up on election day, whereas 40% will vote early by absentee or will vote in person early. Whereas Dem 60% will vote early in person or by absentee, and 40% on actual election day. Independents, I'm splitting 50-50. I then take those numbers and multiply them by an adjusted mail-in and early voting percentage number here for Republicans 1.5 multiplier, whereas for Democrats it's 0.67, meaning about 0.67% of those that showed up early via in-person voting or absentee voting will be remaining for Democrats, and 1.5 times what showed up in the adjusted or the mail-in versus and early voting will expect it to show up same day voted. So I've adjusted those and taken these numbers and then multiplied them by the actual mail-in and early voting. For example, Trump has so far in the state of Pennsylvania had 128,691 votes. Multiply that by 1.5 and he should be getting 321,727 votes if the election were held today, giving him a total of 18% of the vote in Pennsylvania. Whereas Democrats, Harris would be expecting 34% of the overall vote, meaning that she's ahead. But in terms of others, 48% are neither registered Republican or Democrat. And that's quite significant. So it gives plenty of room for either Donald Trump to catch up and pass Kamala Harris, or for Kamala Harris comfortably continue the lead into actual election day and thereafter. So that's where I'm getting my data. So far, you can see the total votes cast, and this should say as of October the 16th. I know that each of these say October 11th. I'll correct that at some point. 536,000 votes have been cast in the state of Pennsylvania. And in Georgia, we have 328,000 being cast, with our totals suggesting 157,000 plus, or roughly 48% registered as Democrat, 45% registered as GOP, and then the remaining 7% as other, giving them a giving the Dems a slight edge, 3% edge of those votes cast thus far out of the 100% in early voting. Now, after all of our multipliers, we see that it's not enough to give Harris the win in Georgia if the election were held today. We would expect Trump to get 55% of the vote and Harris to get about 39%. And only about 7% would go under the category other, and that's not enough to make up for the difference. Thus, we would expect to give Trump the state of Georgia at this time. And now, going over to our election map, let's go ahead and apply those two states. So we have Pennsylvania going to Harris and Georgia going to Trump, giving us a count of 245 for Harris and 165 for Trump. I've kept out Texas and Florida. Otherwise, Trump would have 235 to Kamala's 245. Now let's go back to our spreadsheet and move on to the next state of Texas. So far, Republicans have cast the most votes, 37,000 compared to 35,000 for Dems, a total of 78,000 votes cast thus far as of the 16th of October. But after our multipliers, if the election were held today, we would expect Trump would get 57%, Harris about 36%. And the remaining 6% is not enough to give Harris a makeup. So we would give Texas to Donald Trump as it stands today. And so that brings them up to 205 to Democrats 245. Let's move on to our next state of Florida. Florida has so far cast 600,000 plus votes, of which 36% of those have been GOP, 44% have been Dem, and roughly 20% under the category of other. Now with that, with the multipliers, we would expect more showing up, of course, on election day for Trump than will for Harris. When we add all the numbers together, Trump walks away 44%, Harris 36%, and 20% remaining for other, meaning Trump gets the state. But given that there's nearly 20% under the category other, Harris still has a chance to take this state if she gets enough of the independent vote. But as it stands, it's now favoring Donald Trump. So I'm going to give Florida to Donald Trump, bringing the total to 245 to Republican Trump 235. Now let's move on to our next state. Now, if you look at the first video, Donald Trump won the election by winning the state of North Carolina. If that had gone over to Kamala Harris, then Kamala Harris would win the U.S. presidential election. But let's see if things have changed. So let's leave North Carolina for now. I'm going to leave it, and we're going to skip down to Michigan. Michigan has cast so far 670,000 plus votes, of which 35% have gone to GOP, 56% to Dems, and about 9% to the other category. After all the adjustments, Harris comes out with a slight lead of about 2 to 3% at 46.94 to Trump's 44.01. Now, the remaining 9% is enough for Trump to make up the difference. However, at this time, if the election were held today, Harris would win. So at this time, I'm going to give that state over, Michigan, to Harris. Now, the other thing you want to bear in mind as we're doing this is, of course, using this model, which is not perfect, but I believe better than polling. We would have to keep in mind that a lot of the data coming in will depend on how geographically accurate we are having those numbers come in. For example, in the state of Pennsylvania, here is the top counties: Philadelphia, Allegheny, Montgomery, Bucks, and Delaware, so forth and then Lancaster. So we would like to believe that the votes are mainly coming in, the most votes are coming in from these 5 counties, these 6 counties. So let's take a look if that's true. So Philadelphia is over here in the red, Allegheny is over here in the red, and this darker orange rather in this map. This is by population. Montgomery is just outside, and Bucks is just north of, I believe, or to the northeast of Allegheny County. And then Delaware over here somewhere, and then Lancaster, I believe, somewhere in the middle of the eastern half of Pennsylvania. So let's take a look at that distribution of population and see whether or not early voting is showing up in that way. So what we're seeing here is most of the voting, the darker it is where most Dems are showing up to vote. They're outnumbering the Republicans. And you see Pittsburgh, Montgomery County, which is and then Philadelphia, and then as we would expect, Delaware, and then right there kind of in the middle, as we would expect Harrisburg. So this is pretty accurate. So in terms of being geographically accurate, I would say it's fairly accurate. Now let's go back to the next state, and we're going to look at Wisconsin. So far casting nearly 240,000 votes. 19% of them go to GOP, 40% going to Dem, and then 41% under the category of other. After our multipliers, we have Trump likely to receive 24% of the vote, Harris 34% of the vote, and that's of course without the independents. So that means Harris has the lead, but 40% is quite substantial under the category of independent, so it is very possible this could go either way, and Trump has quite a bit of room to be able to catch up and surpass Harris. But as it stands today, October the 16th, Harris is winning the state of Wisconsin. So let's go over to our electoral map and give that to Harris. Now, with that, that means Harris has received the needed 270 electoral votes, giving her the win. Now, how is this different from yesterday? Yesterday, Michigan was going over to Donald Trump. But with the new batch of votes coming in, it now has tilted over to Harris. But again, let's take a look at Michigan, and we can see that Michigan, we have it coming out to 46.94 for Harris after our multiplier, and 44% for Trump, meaning that's only about a 2 to 3% difference, and then 10% under the category of other. And if this holds up, then Harris would win. But since there's 9% independent, it still could go over to Donald Trump. That's why it's shifting back and forth, depending on the new batch of votes. So stay with us, subscribe, give a thumbs up, and we'll continue doing this. And tomorrow or the day after, when we get more data, that may change. But as it stands today, Harris is winning because she has taken the blue wall. Now let's go on and move to North Carolina, now that we know Harris has won if the election were held today. And let's go back up to North Carolina. In North Carolina, roughly 57,000 votes have been cast. Of those, 27% to GOP, 37% to Dem, 36% under independent. Still, nonetheless, after the multipliers, Donald Trump will end up taking the state at 33.55 to Harris's 30.65 if the election were held today without the independents. But the largest batch of the votes is coming from independents, meaning the state still could go either way very easily. So that's why you want to subscribe and keep up with the numbers as we go along. As we get new data, I'll put up a new video. But as it stands today, if the election were held today, Donald Trump would take North Carolina. So let's go ahead and move on to the West, and we'll start with Nevada. And in the state of Nevada, there hasn't been a lot of data coming in at this point. There's only been 5,881 votes, but of those, 47 to GOP, Dem's 26%, 27% under the category Other, meaning clearly Donald Trump at this point is way ahead at 55%, whereas Harris has 20%. And that 25% difference could make a difference because that comes out to 55-3-1, but that would mean Harris would have to get every one of those votes. But with just 5,000 votes, that's not much. Nonetheless, at this point, Donald Trump has the state of Nevada. And that brings it to 257 for Donald Trump, 270 for Kamala Harris. And then finally, let's look at our last state, Arizona. Same thing here, only 16,000 plus votes have showed up. 54% is going GOP, 25% to Dems, and 21% to Other, meaning that at this point, Donald Trump clearly is way ahead at 61.74% of the vote. To Harris's 19%, and then the remaining 19% for independents. So we're going to go ahead and give the state of Arizona to Donald Trump. So he's only 2 electoral votes away from the White House. Now yesterday, it was Donald Trump who would have won if the election were held on October the 15th. But as of today, October 16th, Kamala Harris is taking the lead. So you can see how close the election is based on our model. Couple other things I just want to point out very quickly. If we go to the state of Georgia, which gave us a huge batch of votes yesterday, we can take a look at where those votes are coming in. And that would let us know what's going on. Like, what's the demographics? So let's look at the age breakdown. 48% Democrats, we said before, so far voting, 344,000. 45% Republican, 7% Independent. And gender is at 54% female, 46% male. Now, if we go to the vote in 2020, we see that at the national level, men voted at a rate of 53% for Trump compared to 45% for Biden. Women voted 57% compared to 42% for Biden. So women will definitely have to get at least 57% of the vote nationwide or plus in order to match or improve upon Joe Biden's numbers. That's presuming that they vote in a similar fashion in which they did in 2020. A couple other things that are changing is some of the demographics. African American Hispanics are more leaning toward Trump than they have before, whereas white vote is more leaning toward the Democrats than they did in 2020 as it stands so far. And then finally, going back to this NBC News website, nationally there has been 6.8 million votes cast, mail-in or early in-person votes thus far. If we look at the gender, as we said before, females are falling behind compared to 2020 at 53%, whereas males at 45%. That difference of 2%, even if I split it up, would be 46% male, 54% female. That's just not going to be enough, or it's going to be so close. And that's how it's reflected in the model that we're using. It literally is borderline. So it's quite crazy how this is turning out. Again, I believe this model is going to be far more accurate than using polling and any other model that I have seen thus far. So if you like this, feel free to comment. Let me know what you like about it. And if you want to continue to see how things change between now and Election Day, then be sure to subscribe and thumbs up.